All right, as I mentioned, today we're going to talk about advanced client-side rendering using JavaScript template engine specifically. My name is Phil Jirsa. I'm a senior SharePoint consultant with Rackspace. If you'd like to contact me, that's my email address there at the bottom, phil.jirsa@rackspace.com. You can also follow me on Twitter. My handle is @pajirsa, and my blog is located at www.36mph.com. The 36 mph stands for 36 miles per hour, which is the maximum slalom competition speed in the open men's slalom division. So you can see there's a nice picture of me there out doing some water skiing on the lake that I live on here last summer. So kind of a sad time of year for me right now as things are getting a little bit cold up here in Minnesota and the lakes are starting to freeze over. So definitely looking forward to next spring when I can get back out there and do some water skiing. The agenda for today, we're going to spend just a little bit of time and do a quick review of client-side rendering, just in case you aren't super familiar with it. But I'd like to kind of breeze through that, not spend a ton of time doing, kind of like the Hello World demos and so forth. I'd really like to focus more on kind of our advanced topic for the day, which is using the JavaScript templates. So we'll introduce you to that topic, and then finally we'll get into some demonstrations. All right, so let's just review client-side rendering really quick. It's CSR, and this is the definition that I came up with, or came up for it. It's basically JavaScript code that's used by SharePoint 2013 list views and forms to create the final HTML output of list data to the browser. CSR is also used in display templates, which can be leveraged for like custom search results or the content search web part. But today we're going to focus specifically on examples that leverage client-side rendering to override your list views and forms. So we'll kind of narrow down our focus to those scenarios specifically. And if you want to look into additional ways to extend CSR, there are some resources available at the end of the presentation and some blog posts that you can use to learn more about display templates and the other topics I mentioned. So let's use it in a sentence. Watch me use CSR to create a SharePoint list view that will blow your mind. So basically what I'm talking about is we've got a list in SharePoint. In this example, I've got a list of stores that I imported from the AdventureWorks database. And it looks just kind of like, plain boring old list data. And we want to convert that into being a little bit less boring list data. So here I've used some client-side rendering to strip out the default view of our list view web part, and it's rendering just an ordered list of the store titles, and then using a map framework to render a map and put some push pins out there that represent the various store locations we had from our list. So I'll show you a live working version of that demo a little bit later on, but that's just a little bit of a taste for what can be done using client-side rendering in a list view. So what are some of the things that it can do? Conditional formatting. This is something if maybe you've done a lot of customizations or maybe some low-code solutions or no-code solutions in SharePoint 2010 using SharePoint Designer. You're familiar with opening up a list view and customizing it using the nice WYSIWYG, the graphical interface in SharePoint Designer. You can click on a column and say, I want to add conditional formatting to that based on its value. In this example we see on the screen here, we're highlighting any tasks that have been completed with green, and anything else has a gray background to it. So something that's fairly simple to do in SharePoint 2010 using SharePoint Designer. Unfortunately, in SharePoint 2013, with Designer now, they've kind of stripped the Designer out of that, and you only get the code view. So what's happening in 2010 when you did this is behind the scenes it's creating an XSL template to kind of do the transformation and render the final output then to the client's browser. And if you wanted to do that same thing in 2013, you can. It's backwards compatible with XSL. However, now if you wanted to create new content for that or create some new customizations, you're going to be editing the actual XSL code itself, which can be rather verbose and a little bit difficult to kind of follow and look at. So client-side rendering is the new mechanism or the new functionality available in 2013 that we can use to create customizations for our list views and forms, and it's much easier to develop against than XSL, and obviously there's a lot of developers that are familiar already with modern web technologies and using JavaScript. So hopefully you've got kind of a wider base of developers that you could leverage to help create some customizations for you. So conditional formatting is one example of something you can do in client-side rendering. You could also use it to do field controls. This is a little bit more limited to on-premise solutions where you would create a custom class to represent a new field type basically, and then you'd override the JS link property to specify where the JavaScript resides that you're using to render the custom control. So an example here is the highlighted option there is a favorite color field, but another example could be instead of having a user have to type in a number in a field when they create a new list item or edit it, maybe it's like a percentage for task completion or something, you could instead render a slider control that would let them, slide left or right to set the value of that field. So that's an example of a field control. Display templates. This is the example we saw a little bit earlier where we're not just applying some formatting to a field or a row within the list. We want to kind of strip out the entire view of that list and insert our own formatting and UI to that. So that's an example of doing a display template. This is also something you could do with these search results, custom search results, by using a display template that you define and upload to your master page gallery. Those become available then in those web parts. An interactive UI, this is supposed to be funny, but basically, you get the idea that using JavaScript and modern web technologies, we can come up with a lot of really cool things. I mean, there's a lot of fancy games and so forth available on the internet today that are done completely using JavaScript. Not that you would maybe do this within client-side rendering in SharePoint, but the idea is that really you are presented with the data from your list view, and using JavaScript, HTML5 and CSS, you can tie that in with your client-side rendering and present that data in any form or fashion that you'd like to. So let's jump out of the slides and we will take a quick look at just kind of some of this overview information that I gave you. We'll look at a simple example. And let me see here. I will go over to my SharePoint 2013 virtual machine that I have spun up, and you can see the demo I'll be showing you here is a products list. So again, I've imported just a subset of data from the AdventureWorks database. And we've got some products that have their name and a description and so forth. And we'd like to presumably create some customizations for this list that would, maybe we're going to expose our site as an extranet, or maybe it's a public-facing internet site, and we've got, a list of products that we sell, and we want to be able to maintain our products in a list that can be edited by our internal users, but, for the extranet or our public-facing internet users, we want to give them maybe more of like a product catalog sort of view. So we'd like to apply some better styling and formatting to this list. So that's kind of the overall goal of the demo that I'll be showing you today. But let's just start off with some basics and show you a quick code sample here on how to create some client-side rendering. Excuse me. So I like to use Visual Studio as my text editor. You don't have to do this. Obviously, you could use Notepad, or even if you're just uploading your JavaScript files directly to your master page gallery, you could open it up in SharePoint Designer and edit it directly that way. For me, I personally am a developer and I'm used to working in Visual Studio, and I like some of the automatic code formatting and syntax highlighting and so forth that's available with that. So that's why my code samples are here in Visual Studio, but you can definitely use whatever text editor or code editing tool that you wish to use. All right, so this is our demo1.js file. This is what we're going to point our list view at and say, okay, this is the JavaScript file that contains the override I'd like you to apply to our list view. So you can see it's pretty straightforward. I've got my JavaScript code wrapped in an anonymous self-invoking function, which basically means it will just encapsulate my code cleanly for me and not pollute the global namespace with any of the variable names that I'm creating and so forth. It's just kind of a good practice in JavaScript to do this, provide some encapsulation. Um, so the first thing I do is I just create an empty object that will contain a templates property, and then by using that templates property, I can choose which specific CSR templates that I'm going to override for this list view that we'd like to customize. So in this case, I've got an item override, and I'm specifying the name of a function that will be called as the CSR, I guess I call it the framework or the runtime. It's not truly a runtime, but as client-side rendering is doing its processing on your SharePoint list view, when you do an item override like this, that function will get called for each item in the list and give you the opportunity to look at the data that's coming in with that item and present it, put together a string of HTML basically to present that information in whichever form or fashion that you want to. So you can see down here is the definition of our function called item override. For an item override, we are passed a single argument, which represents kind of the context of that specific item. However, there is a lot more data available on that argument other than just the current item itself. So when I jump over to the live demo here, I'll show you how you can access that information and inspect things and debug it. And then what we're doing is for each item, we just want to say, build me an empty string that I can sort of concatenate the various HTML elements and data properties together for the final display. So I'm just taking the current item's title, wrapping that inside of a div so I get it on a new line, and then returning that result. So it has to return a string that represents the final HTML that should be presented to your client's browser. So if I switch back over here to Internet Explorer on my list, I've got this already wired up in my Demo 1 view. So I will click on that, and if my SharePoint server didn't go to sleep on me here, it should switch over to that. There we go. And you can see it's a fairly straightforward, fairly simple demonstration, but we've got the title of each item, and it's wrapped in a div. So a couple things to note here is I mentioned that there's a lot more information that comes with that object other than just the current item and its properties. So how do we inspect that and determine what other information is available to us? Maybe look at what are the different property names that are available to us. So I would break into my developer toolbar to do that, and I can go either to my console or right to my script tab here on the developer toolbar. And if I look here on my list of JavaScript files that have been loaded, I have a demo1.js. So this has been wired up because I specified on my list view the JS link property should point at this JavaScript file. And this is what we were just looking at, obviously, in Visual Studio. So let's try to set a breakpoint here inside of our item override function so that we can stop it right there as it's processing and inspect that data that's coming in. So I'll set my breakpoint and say start debugging. All right, so the page is refreshed or it's reloaded, and you can see that we've hit our breakpoint here. And what I'd like to do then is just click over to the Locals tab so that I can inspect the different data objects that are available to me at this point in the execution of our JavaScript. So we've got our item context object there. That's the argument that was passed into our function. And if I expand that, I can see that there are quite a number of properties available within this argument that we were given. Most of them, if you kind of quickly browse through here, are related to things like the base view ID, so a lot of kind of the list specific information, where the display form URL is, where the edit form URL is. So if I needed to generate my own buttons or links to the various forms or something, I've got kind of immediate access to all that within my argument there. You can see here is our current item. Interestingly enough, if you scroll down a little ways, we also get a reference to all of the list data that's displayed within this list view. Inside of each item, we get a reference to basically all of the rest of the list items. This kind of follows, though, or it should um, it only be the list items that are visible on this page. So, right, like when you create your list view in SharePoint and you say, here are the different columns that I want to have visible, here's the default sort, order, any grouping that you might put in there. CSR is going to, get its data objects, and they will mirror image basically what you've defined in your list view. So if you don't specify that a column should be visible when you're creating the list view, it won't be available to you then within the properties of your item within your CSR code. So that's one important thing to note, is that make sure when you're creating your views that any data properties that you'd like to have available to you immediately in your overrides, you should make sure that you specify those as columns to be displayed in your list view. So, and again, if you had paging set up and I wanted to only see 10 items on a page, this list data collection right here would, if I open up this rows array, that would only contain 10 items. And then up here, I could look at these other properties that tell me, the index of the first row and the last row being displayed to see. And I'm not sure why I just got that pop up, but hopefully we don't have an issue going on here. It looks like we're still broadcasting. Okay. Um, so that's list data, but it's just whatever is visible on the current page of your list view. So let's go and inspect the current item really quick, and we'll take a peek here. You can see that, several of the kind of hidden properties, or properties like related to the file type and like content type ID and so forth, those are there by default for us automatically. But then, things like the title and the thumbnail photo URL, photo ID, those are properties that I had to specify I'd like to be visible on my list view when I created it. So that's how you would go in and inspect the current item that you're getting here in our item context for our override function to see the names of the properties that I'd like to be able to use. It isn't always completely straightforward. The names that come through in these properties actually don't necessarily match up with either the display name or the internal name of the fields that are defined on your list. So I'm not exactly sure what mechanism they're using to generate those. It looks like it might be like if you're familiar with doing like data view web parts in the past where you have to do like camel queries and so forth, it might kind of be like um, the name for the field that you might use from a camel query or like a search property. So it might be generating them that way, but the point is you don't want to rely on the display name or the internal name of the field from the list itself to know what that name of the property is here in the JavaScript object. So this is a good way to come in and just validate that you've got all your property names correct that you're trying to access. Otherwise, you might run into some errors in your script. All right, so let's go ahead and just tell it to stop debugging so it'll finish running through the script. So it ran this function obviously for each item there. And then let's look at one other thing quick before I get into my reason for using JavaScript templates here. So if I switch over to my console and I look quickly back here at our script code, in order to wire up our override, we have to make a call to the SP Client Templates template manager and tell it that we want to register a new template override by passing in this context object where we defined, which templates we're overriding and what function should be called when that happens. So let's go out really quick and just inspect this template manager to see what that is and what else might be available to us when using that object. So let me just copy paste it really quick so I don't have to rely on my poor typing skills. There we go. So I'll just type that into the console in my script debugger. And basically what this does is kind of gives me an immediate inspector into this object. So you can see that it's just a JavaScript object. It's got a few properties on it as well as some methods that we can use. This one should look familiar here, the register template overrides. Um, if I do this again and I call the get templates method, we'll be able to see that indeed we have an item template override already defined, and that should look familiar. That's the name of the function that we defined in our script file over here. But there's also other functions defined as well that we didn't do these ourselves. So SharePoint 2013 by default is using client-side rendering for its list views. And so that's what we're seeing here in this object is the out-of-the-box overrides that SharePoint itself is using when it's processing the list view using client-side rendering. So it's already got a view, a body, and so forth. If I go ahead and just look at one more property on this object, the template overrides object itself. This is a collection of the objects that represent the various templates we are allowed to override. So I would definitely spend a little bit of time getting to know this list. It's not super well documented, I guess. There are examples that I've seen in various blog posts and so forth that just give specific examples of maybe like an item override or a view override and show you different things you can do with fields. But this is what's possible. These are the override templates, or excuse me, the templates that you are allowed to override using client-side rendering. And the other thing to note is that the way that they're processed by SharePoint 2013 is basically in the order that they're listed here. So it will start with the view, and if it can't find that there's an override defined for the view, it will just render the default view and then proceed down to the header, look for a customization there, and so forth, almost kind of like a switch statement where it just keeps falling through to the next level until it can find where a user-defined override has been inserted, and then it will step out of its normal processing and do that. The point being there is that with an item override, such as the one we just demonstrated, I'm not impacting anything above that level. So I wouldn't be impacting the group or the footer and so forth, just the item level down. So now I'm responsible for everything that used to be rendered at the item. I have to define exactly which properties of that item should be displayed and how they should be displayed. But everything above that is left alone or rendered by default. As I move up this list here and go higher up, let's say I was to override the body or the view, now I'm responsible for the entire body or view of that list view, and that means I would have to iterate myself through the items and basically define everything about how that is displayed, and it sort of then kind of breaks the chain of the default rendering at the levels below that. So that's kind of one important thing to note, I guess, is maybe just figure out what's the lowest level you can get away with the customizations that you want to use, so that you can still leverage the out-of-the-box capabilities that come with those other templates. So you can see here in our example that we still have our toolbars up here, the search, that's our header. We also have, I made a mistake here, and our header is actually down at the bottom of the list. I had some invalid HTML in my sample, but if we had done a complete view override here, all of that would go away, and we would be responsible for rendering all of that ourselves. All right, so another thing to notice then, this is kind of setting up for the JavaScript templates, is to define an override, we have to give it the name of a function, and basically the result of that needs to be a string. So you can see that, quite simply here, we just said, well, we want to spit out the title, and we could have, maybe done some more string concatenations and added in a few more properties and things like that. But in theory, you would probably, if you're making a reasonably complex template here or an override, you would probably get maybe like a creative comp from someone who's a designer, or the HTML is going to be a little bit more complex that you come up with for what your final display should be. and it becomes difficult or unmanageable quite quickly to maintain that, right? Like you're kind of building up these strings and slicing and dicing all this HTML and inserting properties where they should go. So you might be able to spend a good deal of time putting that together, but then, once it goes to testing, or once it's deployed finally, and maybe some of the users aren't happy with that and they want an alteration to it, like you displayed the image on the right and they wanted the image to be on the left or something. Well, so an easy change like that might not be too bad, but if it was kind of an overhaul or a more complex change, you might have to send it back to your design team, and then you'd have to either go through the process again of slicing and dicing this, or you're going to send them this and say, can you work with it and figure it out for me? Like basically, it's going to create some complications when you need to maintain this. And it's also, kind of difficult to read this, and it's error prone in my opinion. Like if you had to insert some quotes and, making sure that your HTML is well formed and so forth, you can see how, if we could find a better solution to provide this portion of what we're doing, that would probably be a lot more ideal. So that's where the JavaScript templates are going to come in. And let me hop back over to our slides really quick to explain a little bit more about that. So the way that I've been thinking about this lately is trying to uh, imagine it in the sense of the MVC development pattern, where the CSR that we're creating, our model is represented by the item data or the list data that we're receiving. Our controller is really the JavaScript file, or the JavaScript code that's registering our override, and then the function that gets called each time we hit an item or the view. But then really the view in this scenario is missing, right? The controller at this point, as we just saw, is responsible for dynamically generating the view, and doing that by sort of just concatenating together a bunch of strings, and inserting data where you want it to go. So what if we could come up with a good way then to add this view component in to what we're doing and sort of abstract that away or remove that from the controller's responsibility, to try to make it a little bit more manageable. So some of the benefits of using this technique would be that we get a better separation of concerns. We would no longer have to worry about all this view logic or code happening inside of our CSR JavaScript file, or the controller in this case. We would also get better maintainability, because what we'd like to be able to do here is define our view just using plain HTML, just define a template that we can use and maybe put some placeholders in it where data should go. And that's much easier to maintain, right? If I send that over to my designer, he's going to be able to easily recognize the structure of that HTML and make some edits to it for me based on his comps that he maybe came up with. And that's a lot easier than kind of slicing and dicing things up and building strings up. So it makes the maintainability a lot easier there. And also just kind of that decoupling of the view from our controller. So we don't have to rely on our JavaScript file anymore to hold all of the compilation or the building up of that view code that's going to be displayed to the end user. So let's go look at a little bit of sample code, and I'll explain how this works as we go. We'll hop back over here to Visual Studio. So here's what I'd like to be able to do. I'm going to show you the display template that I'm coming up with. And really what we want to do here is define right here, I'm going to highlight it, is the template of what I'd like to be displayed for each of our data items on the list. So I can put that inside of a script tag that's, basically won't be displayed as HTML on the page, but as long as that script tag element with this code defined in it lives someplace on our page, then we can leverage a JavaScript template engine to go grab it. We'll compile it using that template engine, and then you can see we've got some placeholders here. In this case, I'm using a framework called Handlebars.js. So this is the format that it uses for its placeholders. These are the names of properties coming from our data that the template engine will strip out and replace with the specific instance of the data that we pass to it when we make a call to our template. The result of all that then, after you call your template and it replaces all that, is it returns back to you the resulting string of this, which now that maybe starts to make a little bit of sense is kind of what we were doing here in our function is, it ultimately just needs to return a string of HTML that can then be displayed on the client's browser. So let's replace that with the handlebars framework, the template engine that will go grab our script tag from our page, do some processing on it, and then we can just make a call to that template every time we've got some new updated data and get the result back and return that instead as our item override that we want to display. So I've got another JavaScript file here set up for that. It should look still fairly similar. We still got the item override happening, but we've stripped some of the code out of that we were doing, that we're doing the string concatenations and building up our results. We've inserted a few new elements here. One of them is I'm now using the on pre-render override. The on pre-render and on post-render overrides are basically a way for you to specify a function or functions that you'd like to have called either directly before CSR happens on the page or directly after CSR happens on the page. So the reason why I'm doing this here is because with our template processing, I've got some dependencies on the framework itself, which needs to be included within our environment. And unless I would go to the master page or something and include that script dependency right at the top before any of the other scripts load, I'm not always guaranteed that it will be there at the time that this anonymous self-invoking function executes, since CSR code gets loaded and this will run fairly early on in that process. So I needed to make sure that when I call my template processing, that jQuery, which is I've included that just for ease of use, I guess, in grabbing my template. But some of my script dependencies, such as jQuery and the handlebars JS framework, would already be there. And so if I put that in the on pre-render, I know that all the other scripts have now loaded on the page, and I'm just at that stage right before we're going to go through and process each of my items. So I make a pre-render override here and assign that, and the definition is down here on line 15. And basically I'm just saying, okay, I want to create a variable for the HTML that was inside of my template. Again, that came from this script tag here. We're going to grab that, which needs to live on our page, and I can include that either with a content editor or just by dumping this into some kind of a hidden maybe a script resource element or something on the page. It basically just needs to live on the page someplace, so we'll make sure that that happens. We're going to grab it by the ID, get the HTML inside that tag, put it in there, and then I make a call to my handlebars framework and tell it to compile the template and give me an object that I can use then to pass data in to get my results later as I'm trying to go through and get the resulting string out of that template. So I'm going to assign that here to my template variable. And then finally, once my item override starts to happen, we still have that item context being passed in. And now all I have to do is make a call to my template object that's been created and pass in the data that it should use to then go through and strip out the placeholders that we specified. So I'm giving it the current item from the item context. And then these placeholders just need to be valid property names on that data object that I passed in. So these are the field names that we saw from before in the script debugger that exist on the current item itself. And remember, those have to be specified that you want them displayed from, when you're creating your list view, otherwise they won't be available. And basically, it'll just fail to replace that item then if it can't find the property. So let's see how that works. I've already uploaded this file. I went and put it in the master page gallery of my SharePoint site, and I'm going to just point a content editor web part at it so that it will load on our list view page. And then demo 2 is the JavaScript file I'm going to point the JS link property at this time. So if I go back over here and I switch over to demo 2, now with some good luck, we should see more of this product catalog format that I came up with. Again, I'm a dev. I came up with this template on my own and didn't spend a whole lot of time on it, so it's a pretty trivial example, but I think you get the idea. You can see we've got like this image on the left, and then instead of just kind of the tabular formatting of the rest of the data, we've got, kind of like a slightly larger font here for the product type, and then the specifics in the description and so forth. So, you could do some other formatting there as well if you wanted to maybe make those smaller and have them in like more of a flow layout, right? So you'd see kind of each product, and then it would automatically wrap to the next line when you ran out of room on the screen. You could do that. It just all becomes CSS basically at that point. So that's, in a nutshell, I guess, the concept of using a JavaScript template for client-side rendering. It looks like we've got just a few questions here on the webinar, so let's take a pause real quick here, and I'll try to answer some of these questions, and then we'll finish up. So the first question I see here is, could I explain what connects the JavaScript to the view in the list? So let's use this as an example right here, and I will put this page into edit mode. I didn't want to do a whole lot of this wiring up on the demo. We'll just do it once here because unfortunately my demo environment is a little bit slow, so I didn't want you guys to have to kind of wait around as we did each of those clicks. But all I do basically the location of the JavaScript file that we created. So there's that demo2.js. That's what I created over here in Visual Studio, and I just uploaded it to my master page gallery for the purposes of this demo. This is a technique that would work if you're not able to, deploy. If you don't want to create a solution to deploy it as a module, or you don't want to deploy a farm solution and put it in layouts or something. Maybe you're using Rackspace's per user SharePoint environment or something like SharePoint Online, and you just have site collection admin rights. You could still upload files to your master page gallery using this technique, and then just point your JS link, URL at it. One thing to note, I think this is kind of a gotcha, but this URL that you specify needs to start with a token, so it needs to be either the the little squiggle, the tilde, I think that's called, site, or site collection. I believe layouts also works there. But if you just put in a straight up URL, it doesn't like that. It's actually expecting that it begins with one of these SharePoint URL tokens. So make sure that you kind of take note of that, and otherwise you might be scratching your head a little later on. So that's basically how you wire it up. The other thing that's happening again in this particular demonstration is we're using that JavaScript template that I defined. So I had to upload that to my master page gallery as well, and then I just put it in this hidden content editor up here. So I take the content editor and just using the content link property of it, I can point it at my, it's just a txt file or whatever in my master page gallery, and that will then ensure that our script tag containing the template that we defined exists on this page, and our CSR can find it when it goes out and looks for it to do the template processing. So that's kind of an extra step that you need to take when you're using this JavaScript templates, is to make sure that basically the view component of what you've defined is available. Some homework maybe that you can try yourself is a lot of the JavaScript template engines have some capabilities around dynamically loading templates, so you can kind of configure the properties of your particular template engine and tell it, well, here's kind of the root folder where all of my views live, and then based on naming convention, it can dynamically load the views as it detects that they become necessary. So that's kind of an extension of what we're doing here. Maybe if you didn't want to always have to rely on specifically adding your view in, you could potentially configure your JavaScript template engine of choice to dynamically template for you. How you wire that: go into the list view, edit the web part, and then specify the JS link property that contains the JavaScript that you created. Another quick note there is security or basically, access to those files. You have to make sure that the users on your site, maybe if they have some more restrictive permission sets going on, just make sure that wherever you do put that file that it is available to all users that will need it, because it does have to, obviously be downloaded from your site to the client's browser. So if it's not available or they have to authenticate to get to it, that will cause problems. All right, we've got one more question. How does the list know your JS file? And I think that's kind of the same question that we just had, is you would use that JS link property to specify here is the JavaScript file that you should load for the particular CSR customization I'm creating. All right. So with that, we've got about quarter till. That is kind of the demo of building up the JavaScript template live demo. I can go over and show you the live demo over here really quick of the map. And what I did there is, again, I just had a list of, in this case, it was stores that came from the AdventureWorks database that have addresses specified on them. So if I go into my stores list, basically what I did is used a body override to say I don't want you to display any of the default data in the list view. I want to just iterate through the list items, display each one in an ordered list, and then in a separate div that will appear on the right-hand side of my screen, I used a mapping framework called Mapstraction, which is very handy if you need to deal with multiple mapping providers. It basically abstracts away all the specifics about the various mapping APIs that exist. So all you need to tell it is, here's the one I want you to use, and here's my API or developer key for that particular framework, and then all of your code is in the Mapstraction API, so you don't have to rewrite it if you switch to a different provider. So if, in this case, when I click on my map here, it's going to render my list, and I've got it displaying a Google map. So if, for whatever reason, if I was told that we can't use that anymore, or if you even maybe wanted to make it user selectable so they could choose the map that they're used to seeing, you could do something like that, have a drop down that would switch it on the fly. It's very easy to do then, because all of the code that's telling this map what size it should display and what zoom level and so forth, and actually going through the list items and putting each pin on the map, all of that code can remain the same. You just tell Mapstraction that you want to render it using a different mapping provider. So that's a very handy tool, and I've got a link to that in my resources slide at the end. But you can see here it did render the map. We've got our items. It put all the push pins on here. It's not an image. I'm dragging that around. I don't know how well that comes through on the GoToWebinar, but it is an actual live Google map. And when I hover over one of these push pins, we get a title there. That was sent to the mapping framework from my CSR code as well, so that's all completely customizable. You can send it whatever data you want. So this is, I think, kind of a powerful example of what you could potentially do using client-side rendering and just the data that is available to you from your list. All right, so let's hop back to the slides really quick, and then we'll stay on for a little bit and answer questions that people might have. So just to quickly summarize, we reviewed some of the basics of CSR and just sort of looked at that hello world example, if you will. Then we compared CSR to MVC and kind of made my case for why you might want to use JavaScript templates to create your views and kind of create that decoupling, if you will, from your JavaScript code or your controller in this example. Makes it a lot more maintainable, a lot more manageable. Makes your designers happy, which is always a good thing. So here is my reference slide. If you're not very familiar with client-side rendering, that first link there is a link to Wes Preston's blog. He presented on this topic at the SharePoint conference last year and has a great series of blog posts out there, just kind of like introductory topics around CSR and how to get started. Another good one is if you do a search for Martin Hatch, he also has a very good series with a few more code samples that you can use. And I'll also be uploading my code samples to my blog and GitHub as well. So if you follow the blog URL there at the bottom, 36mph.com, look for that link as well as my own blog post coming soon on this specific topic of using JavaScript templates for client-side rendering. And then just a couple other quick reference links there to the handlebars.js. That's the JavaScript template engine again that I used in my demos, and then that map abstraction framework that I used to render the maps.